We just got done recording episode 2 of the Great Minds podcast with our guest, Wendy Mamer. Wendy works at Augustana University, and we chatted all about her role in admissions, her story with mental health, and the ways in which we can make some changes here in Sioux Falls. She's spoken at TEDx all about her story and her experience with suicide, and you can catch that on YouTube. We just wanted to say thank you so much to Wendy for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy the episode as much as we did. All right. Welcome back to Great Minds, the podcast by Lost&Found. I'm sitting across from my dear friend, Wendy Mamer, and I'm very, very excited to be interviewing with her today and talking all things mental health, suicide prevention, and systems. So, Wendy, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and just introduce yourself, share a little bit about your story and what makes you you, and how you got into the world of mental health education.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first ever podcast recording, so
Wait,
I
really?
am a little bit nervous, but
Don't be nervous. You
excited
got this.
to, kind of talk a little bit about my story and the work that I do. So as you said, I'm Wendy Mamer. I'm the Assistant Director of Admission at Augustana University, and I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. My dad was a farmer, my mom was a teacher, and so I've always really, really loved education. Haven't always been best in school, but I very much understand the importance of it. And so from a young age, even when I was in ninth grade, I kind of had this dream of being a mental health counselor one day. And so mental health has always been something super important to me and something that I've had an interest in. Psychology was always my favorite class. And so that really kind of just grew my interest in studying that in college. And so when I graduated from high school, I went to Augustana University, and I was there for 2 years. And when I was going into my sophomore year, my dad really started struggling quite a bit with anxiety and severe depression. And that is when he kind of started going in and out of inpatient behavioral health treatment here in Sioux Falls at Avera Behavioral. And so kind of unsure of what the future looked like, I transferred home to be closer to home to Southwest Minnesota State University in Marshall. And just given everything that I was going through in my personal life, I dropped my psychology major to a minor. And so just it was hitting too close to home what I was
Oh.
studying. And so graduated from Southwest Minnesota State University in 2016. And then I moved to Sioux Falls and started working at Summit Oaks. It is a psychiatric residential treatment center for youth. And I really loved my time there. It was very hard, very emotional, but I feel like I really found my calling kind of working in the mental health field. But then while I was there, my dad ended up dying by suicide. And so it was just too much for me. I knew I needed to take a step back just because I was hearing about suicide ideation almost every day, and having to be so personal, you couldn't tell the residents that were there what you were going through. And so I kind of
Mhm.
really just needed to create separation. And then I was notified that a position was opening up at Augustana, and I ended up taking it. And I thought, okay, this will get me out of the mental health field for a little bit, and then I'll kind of be able to reflect back on if that's something I want to get back into. And as I started there reviewing college applications, it was like, wow, mental health really affects everybody, not just the people in treatment centers, or not just the people who are even going to counseling. It's just mental health really. Everyone has mental health, and so it
Yeah.
just affects everybody in a different way. And so I was reading these stories and in admission essays and different things like that, and that really opened my eyes to, okay, there's a need for this here too. So how can I get involved? And then I ended up working with a student leader to bring Lost&Found to campus, our first campus mental health organization, and that's something that I
Whoop,
was
whoop.
so proud of. And again, I'd give Haley Nold is her name. She was our first ever president. She was the founder of it, and I give her so much credit because she was just amazing and getting everything in place, and I was just lucky to be part of it.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much going on in your story that I want to talk about. First and foremost, sorry about your father and your loss.
Thank you.
I mean, being vulnerable and sharing your story, obviously, that's part of what we do with Lost and Found. We're working to end suicide and reduce the stigmas and change things up just simply by being vulnerable and sharing our stories. So thank you so much for that. And we're sorry.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's tough. But again, I mean, people know that I'm here because I have changed my experiences. I've turned my own pain into passion. And that's,
Mhm.
how I got into mental health education. And it's funny that you went from mental health education, kind of counseling, psychology into higher education. And I went from higher education into mental health
Mhm.
education. So I think that's really unique too. But yeah, I want to go back to what you said early on. You said that you loved psychology, but you weren't always the best student, but you loved education. You really loved your psychology classes. When did you kind of know, like at what age did you figure out that this is what you wanted to do?
Yeah, well, so I was in ninth grade, and I don't know if you've ever heard of Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. It's called
No.
FCCLA. It's one of those leadership organizations in high school that people can be part of. And so I was in that organization, and one of the projects that I did was called career investigation. And so I would really deeply investigate a career that I was really interested in, that I could possibly see for my future. And I chose mental health counseling. And
Wow.
so it was then that I interviewed our school psychologist to kind of learn a little bit more about what he does, what that looks like, what that field
Mhm.
looks like. And so that really, really sparked my interest. And so then that's why when I went to college, I chose to study psychology. I also studied communication studies. I was a double
Wow.
major. And so that's kind of what led me into that area. But then, given my personal experiences, I kind of went back and forth quite a bit. I really, really loved it. I knew that's what I was passionate about. That's what I was most interested in.
Mhm.
But then after going through what I had been experiencing personally, it really opened my eyes to, okay, this is a really hard career to get involved in too. And
Yeah.
so how can I be involved with mental health advocacy and increasing mental health education without providing counseling, just because for a long time I wasn't in a place that I felt like I could do that. And I still don't know if I could necessarily, but I feel like I'm in a good place now that I can be making a difference without having to be directly in the counseling realm of things.
Wow. That's so interesting. And honestly, it's a great segue into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is systems.
Mhm.
I know your background is in education. That's where you're currently working. I also
Mhm.
know that you have some connections to farming and ranching. And
Yeah.
so I really wanted to spend some time with you there today and talk
Yeah.
about what our, ag systems and what our educational systems are doing to change the landscape of mental health. And so, I think it's interesting that you brought up this leadership opportunity that you had in high school because
Mhm.
I mean that's just one thing that the system of education is doing.
Mhm.
But was there anything that the system of education was doing to get you into psychology or into mental health other than just leading you into the opportunity to talk to your school psychologist, or was that more of a personal journey than a systemic thing?
That was more personal than systemic for sure. And I would say something that I really struggle with for me when we look at the systems that affect mental health, suicide
Hmm.
prevention, mental health education is just that for so long, the responsibility of responding to crisis, mental health crises, or just mental health situations in general has been placed on the wrong people who aren't
Sure.
adequately trained in those areas to be handling those situations. When you look
Hmm.
at first responders, when you look at hospital systems, unless it's a specific behavioral health hospital, then it's different. But emergency rooms, the prison systems. It's
Yeah.
just like people have been responding to those health crises, and they're just not adequately trained to do so. And then when people are put in those situations, especially if it's involving suicide or attempted suicide, that creates a level of trauma. And when you look at the
Hmm.
correlation between suicide and trauma, that just goes to show kind of why there is higher rates of suicide in certain occupations, just because when you deal with trauma all day that you're not necessarily trained or adequately trained
Yeah.
to handle, it can create a problem. And so it's like, how do we address that? And lower the risk of suicide and implement mental health education and integrate systems in place that can adequately meet the needs of the individuals in a mental health
Yeah,
crisis.
absolutely. And I mean, you just drove the point home. Absolutely. I left my last job. I left higher education because I had my own trauma and I was not adequately prepared to respond and to take in and carry the emotion and the toll that, came with my loss and with my trauma.
Mhm.
And so, you just absolutely drove the point home of there's so many people in this world that are responding to these things and they're not adequately trained. And that's really why, when I came on board with Lost and Found and we decided that we were going to do the podcast, we wanted to make it all about systems and all about
Mhm.
what our everyday neighbors are lay people,
Mhm.
but also not lay people, because a lot of the people that we interact with are experts,
Yep.
what they're doing to make these changes. And so,
Mhm.
I think that you're absolutely right. So, with that in mind, what would you say is something that we need to be working on when it comes to these systems to, make changes here, whether it's in Sioux Falls or in South Dakota? But, thinking from your experiences, what are some things that we need to do to get people the adequate training and to make these changes to the systems that are in place?
Yeah, one thing that I think we have seen great benefit from, especially that we've really the pandemic has really done us no favors at all. But one small little bright spot, I just don't want to make less of what the pandemic really is because it's been so terrible, but it really has brought to light how beneficial telemedicine can be.
Okay, 100%.
Especially when you look at small, rural farming and ranching. Doesn't even
Mhm.
necessarily have to be farming and ranching, but traditional most of the time if it's rural, it's likely probably a farming and ranching community.
Yeah.
But just looking at the lack of mental health resources in those communities and how telemedicine can just play such a pivotal role in creating stronger, more resilient communities is so
Mhm,
important.
mhm.
And so, previously, telemedicine wasn't necessarily, it wasn't robust. It wasn't widespread. People didn't necessarily know about it. But
Yeah.
now, there are ways that folks can participate in counseling without having to be there in person.
Mhm.
And especially when you look at the small, small communities who just don't have a mental health clinic or
Yeah.
counseling center available, it's like now it's starting to become more available to those populations. Whether they know it or not, that is a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But creating that access and just having that capability and that possibility, I think, is really important and will definitely move the needle forward in terms of increasing mental health education and being able to take care of oneself. So I think that's been a really, really great step in the right direction, but certainly we need more of it. We need
Mhm,
more
mhm.
advertising and quite frankly, for me, a lot of it comes down to mental health education, just because you don't know what you don't know, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I remember when we were kind of starting to be a little bit more open about what my dad was going through. It was almost like we put so many people's feelings into words in our small farming community,
Mhm.
and just that like other people had been experiencing that too, but they didn't necessarily know it because it was just um so out of the realm of possibilities for what seemingly on the outside is happy families, right? And so being able to kind of provide that educational base of like what does anxiety, depression, addiction, bipolar disorder, what do they look like?
Mhm.
And it looks different for everybody, but just providing some type of basis of education so that they can understand that, okay, maybe this isn't something physical that the doctor just can't find. Maybe it's something greater than that that
Yeah.
can receive help for, but you just need to be able to label it first.
Wow. I mean, I'm just soaking all of what you just said in, but my immediate thought process with teletherapy and, increasing those changes to our systems was what you said about trauma. So many people, myself included, it took me a long, long time to get into therapy because my anxiety kept me from going.
Mhm.
The thought of going into a waiting room was so daunting to me. The thought of like meeting a new person and sharing my life experiences and sharing my trauma was so daunting to me. The thought of like them telling me, this is pretty critical. You are going to carry this with you for the rest of your life, and you're
Mhm.
probably never going to get past this. But I'm going to set you up with tools to do so. Was
Yeah.
daunting to me,
Mhm.
because I wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be. And so I think
Yeah.
that, when you talk about telemedicine being one systemic change that we can make, I think you're absolutely right in saying, I think that's the way that we need to be moving because not everyone learns the same way. Not everyone
Mhm.
grows the same way. Not everyone can, say, I'm going to go into a therapist's office and be okay today. Like
Mhm.
that's just not how
Yeah.
everyone functions.
Yeah.
So that was my first thought.
And there's two ways I could take that too. And the fact that, like, some people definitely benefit from in person therapy more than others. And I think, especially if you've had in person therapy before you move to
Yeah,
telemedicine, can be helpful. But also, on the flip side of that, that might be the only type of therapy some people have access to. And so it
right.
really opens up that um, possibility of receiving some type of treatment.
hmm
And so it
Just that
just is.
accessibility piece.
Yes, yes, which has been so lacking in the
hmm
smaller, more rural communities for
Yeah.
sure. And then two, um, the other point I wanted to bring up is that it is so scary. It's not like going to a regular doctor when you go to therapy for the
Right.
first time. I mean, for the most part, say you have an ear infection, you could go to every single doctor, and whether you have a connection with them or not, they'll be able to tell you kind of what's going on and be able to
Sure.
give it to you and explain your diagnosis, what you need to do in a way that you'll understand it, right? Whereas mental health isn't quite the same way. You
hmm
can tell your story, the same story, same symptoms to every person, and they might interpret it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I remember when I went to my first ever counseling appointment, I left and it was just like, oh, like I don't know that that was it. It wasn't a good feeling. It was like a little bit uncomfortable, and it was like I knew there was no way I could build rapport with that person. Like there was just such
hmm
an emotional disconnect almost that it just I knew it wasn't right, and that prevented me from going back to counseling for months. And so then when I finally got the courage, I remember I was in a really, really, really bad place, after everything I had gone through, and when I finally got the courage to go back, it was really hard after that first time when it didn't go so well. It was pretty defeating, and so, um, getting the courage to go back a second time was the most brave thing I've ever done and also the
hmm
best thing I've ever done, and so really creating that understanding that counseling you can't just go to one counseling session and have rapport with your counselor and everything's going to get better. It really does take time to build that relationship, and how
Yeah.
that's just so different than, most type of doctors that, the common person has been to, and so,
Yeah. That's so
really having
interesting.
that patience to find the right counselor and, not get totally defeated that you'll never go back after that first time just
Yeah.
because there's so many. So I could talk about this for literally hours, but just not getting discouraged if that first time or even second time doesn't go well, and just keep going because there is someone out there who can connect with you, but sometimes it just takes time.
Yeah. I mean, I often describe it to people, and I am in the mindset of everyone needs a therapist. That's just,
Mhm.
through my experience, it's the best thing that I've ever done is going back to therapy. And, I describe it to people as like, you put yourself out there on dating apps and to meet
Mhm.
friends in the world and to make professional, like business colleagues and relationships. You're doing the same thing with your therapist.
Mhm.
You want someone that's going to get you and who's going to trust you and who you have trust in, someone who's understanding, but, challenges you in the way that you need, which
Yeah.
is different for everyone.
Mhm.
Like, I don't need the therapists that are like, more hippy dippy and like, let's, talk through this. I need someone that's going to set goals with me and challenge me because
Mhm.
I am more of that hippy dippy kind of
Yeah.
person. So I need someone who's going to like lay it down straight. Like,
Yep.
okay, Joel, reel it in. Here's some goals. Here's some outcomes. Let's get
Yep.
there. What do you want to accomplish? Let's work through it together.
Mhm.
I don't need just like, okay, great job. Like that, thanks for opening up. Like that doesn't help me. So,
Yep.
like you have to work through it and kind of date
Mhm.
your therapists in order to find a relationship that works.
Yeah, for sure. And asking important questions. I mean, my counselor always says, like, the first question you should ask a counselor when you're going to them for the first time is, have they ever been to counseling?
Yeah.
Because if they haven't, then it's kind of like,
Like,
well, do you believe in what you're providing for other people?
yeah.
Because everyone can benefit from it in some way. So, yeah, like that is so important to really, like, almost like a speed dating type
Yeah.
situation. Like, you need to ask important questions that if they're deal breakers for you, you also want a therapist who aligns with your values too,
Mhm.
to some extent. And not saying you won't be challenged, because you certainly will. I think that's another common misconception is everyone thinks they're going to go to therapy and their problems will be fixed because
Yeah.
their counselor is going to make
Mhm.
decisions for them, and that's just simply not true.
Absolutely.
Not true at all. So, yeah, it
But
just
being
it just
challenged
takes
in the right
time
way, I
for
think is
sure.
important. Yeah.
For sure. I remember being in therapy once, and my counselor, I was telling her this dramatic story of mine because I have a few of those, and she was like, "Okay, now remove yourself from the situation. Do a bird's eye view down at what you just described to me, and what role did you play in that situation?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, okay, yeah, maybe I did have something to do with it, you know?" And so it's just like they can really ground you real quick
Mhm.
too. And
Mhm.
it's just, I've seen such a wonderful benefit from therapy. And I know not everyone does. There's many different forms of self care out there,
Yeah.
but for me, that's proven to be so pivotal. And I just wouldn't trade my experiences for the world. And when it comes to therapy and counseling.
Yeah. Completely agree. Okay, so reeling it back in here a little bit, thinking back to systems, we've
Yeah.
talked through telemedicine, we've talked through accessibility, we've talked to that educational piece that you referenced. In terms of education and awareness, what are things that we can be doing every day? Like I think of just something that's easy for everyone to do is just by sharing their stories, and that's really
Mm-hmm.
why this podcast is so important. That's why our 30 days 30 day stories campaign is so
Mm-hmm.
important. Sharing your stories of resilience helps to encourage other people to talk about it. So, what other
Mm-hmm.
ways can we raise awareness and education around mental health?
Yeah, I think it's just talking about the commonplace things that we all do, that we all feel that are related to mental health, and almost make it a little bit more normalized. I
Hmm.
know, like I had said earlier, I'm the advisor for Lost and Found on Augustana's campus. And so
Hmm.
we kind of just try to create programming that's centered around um, topics that students don't necessarily realize are related to their mental health, but they are. So when it comes to time management, when it comes to um, using your resources, and I'm not just talking about counseling, I'm talking about using the writing center, the
Yeah.
tutoring, because how often do students get discouraged when they're not doing well in a class and wait till the last minute to get help when they're not utilizing the
Yeah.
resources that are already there to maximize their potential, and instead seeing it as a resource that you go to when you're struggling, right? Kind of like
Hmm.
counseling,
Hmm.
it's like all of those other resources across the college campus are there to help you succeed,
Yeah.
and you don't have to be in a bad place to utilize them. And so I think really just creating programming that's centered around topics that individuals don't necessarily know are related to mental health, but they are. I mean, when you look at financial literacy, I mean, that is so important too,
Yeah.
creating education about finances, just because all of these, what seem like small things, really play a large role in your overall well being.
Hmm.
And even your physical health, taking care of yourself physically really ultimately it does affect you mentally
Yeah.
too. And so it's like just creating education about how all of these different things really impact your overall well-being, your holistic self. And so it's kind of in a way drawing attention to mental health, but also focuses on something that's a little bit more relatable because I
Mm-hmm.
think to a lot of people, although the stigma is decreasing, mental health is still really scary to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think I do want to point out too, I think it's important to note that when people get to a place where they're vulnerable enough to share their story, that does um for me anyways, I acknowledge my privilege in that because I have had access to therapy
Yeah.
and I do have the ability to pay for it, and because not everybody does. And so I'm thankful for that, but I also um, do sometimes worry about um, sharing my story and how I overcame it because I know that not everybody has access to the same resources that
Mm-hmm.
I do. And so it's like, how do we create access to those resources
Yeah.
moving forward?
Well, I mean, that goes right back into the systems and,
Mhm.
talking through, are there sliding scales? And do, for instance, you work on an institution of higher learning, like,
Mhm.
do they provide your students with free counseling sessions or
Yeah, they
sessions that
do.
don't
Mhm.
require insurance or, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff? It's that's again the kinds of systemic changes
Yeah.
that we're striving towards. And so yeah, I just think that you're absolutely right. There
Mhm.
is privilege in getting to that point of overcoming, but we together are the ones that
Mhm.
have to continue fighting to
Mhm.
get other people to that place too.
For sure. And I am proud to say that our students do receive free counseling, so that's something that's really wonderful. But as you see the increase in students needing counseling, the increase in numbers of
Yep.
students going, it's like everywhere else. There's increased wait lists. Wait lists can be really long
Hmm.
to get into therapy, and so that kind of can create a struggle too. And I think one thing that we struggle with more in probably more in the Midwest, but just overall, I feel like the counseling field in general isn't very diverse. And
Mhm.
so, representation are people having access to therapists and counselors that look like them or that
Yeah.
have the same life experiences as them. Those are important questions that we really should be asking. That the answer is unfortunately typically not the answer that I wish we could
Yeah.
give.
That's interesting that you bring that up because that was something that I was fighting for at my last place of employment. Um, I had voiced some concerns that students were saying that they didn't feel comfortable because we only had two counselors and on campus, and they were both older white people, not older, middle-aged white people.
Mhm,
And so some of our students just didn't feel comfortable going to them. And so that was something that I had brought up to, the people in administration above me.
mhm,
And I worked with my administration to contact the center
mhm,
and figure out who on their staff would be maybe a better fit to come onto campus. And I was told that there was not a single person, and this was a regional organization, there was not a single person of color on their staff. So it's just, you're absolutely right. I think, sometimes we are a little antiquated in our ways, especially in the Midwest, but,
mhm.
like the medical field wasn't always built for or recognized as a diverse place. And
Mhm.
that again just leads into the systemic changes that we need to be making. But
Yeah.
that accessibility piece, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that right now, well, the way we're talking about it's the healthcare system, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
the education system. How do we get more representation within higher education that
Yeah.
go on to receive master's degrees in clinical counseling so
Yeah.
that there is that representation in counseling services? Because, yeah, that's incredibly important
Mm-hmm.
to be able to talk with someone who has shared life experience or can at least empathize with what it is that um, anyone's gone through.
Yeah. Okay, I want to switch gears once again. You live in Sioux Falls. You've been here for a while. I
Yeah,
think
a
that
lot. It goes really fast. I've been here 5 years already, which is so
okay, yeah,
crazy.
great. And you're from the Midwest. I'm curious what, from your perspective, your vantage point, because you've been pretty involved in the community. What are some things that Sioux Falls is doing well when it comes to mental health, That can be counseling, it can be education, it can be, fighting to make changes in the educational systems or the correctional systems or anything else. But what's something that we're doing well right now?
Yeah, well, the triage center, the addition of that has been,
Hmm.
I think, huge. And especially one area of mental health that I feel like isn't talked about enough is addiction and how that leads to um, other mental health conditions too. I mean, normally addiction is diagnosed with other. Um, Actually, I don't know if that's true, so maybe don't put that in there. That's might not be factual.
Well, no, because I think you're right, because you typically are being treated for addiction, but you are using addiction because of another mental
Yes,
health
yes.
struggle that you're facing, I think is what the point that you're
Yes,
trying to
yes.
make. Yes.
And addiction, I feel like, is not a mental illness that is often seen as a mental
As a mental
illness. And
illness. Yeah.
so I think the triage center has been huge. I am super excited that Avera Behavioral is expanding their hospital system
Hmm.
because it's just such a need. And so that is something that Sioux Falls, I feel like, has done incredibly well. Avera's whole behavioral health hospital is beautiful. And so I think just having that resource
Hmm.
is huge. I mean, no, I. I'm from an hour and 15 minutes away, and that's where my dad had to come. It's like
Sure.
that's the closest behavioral health hospital. And so I think that is a huge advantage. I think that continue to hope that there'll be more of those, but that's a benefit for Sioux Falls for
Yeah.
sure. Lost and Found and the work that all of you do within the Sioux Falls community and on college campuses is incredibly important. I think there are quite a few counseling centers available in Sioux Falls.
Hmm.
Um, and so there is some diverse representation within counseling systems. There's at least one. I'm sure there's many more, but sliding scale. So for those of you who might not be familiar with sliding scale, that's where you can pay. The amount you pay for a therapy or counseling session is dependent on income level, right?
Hmm. Yep.
Yep. And so that's something that I feel like not everybody knows necessarily, but that's super important. 211, the Helpline Center, is amazing and
Hmm.
provides really great resources, not only for mental health care, but just a great resource in general to provide information to the public. And so 211 is their number. So I think they do a wonderful job and are a huge benefit to the Sioux Falls community as well. Um, Gosh, I don't want to leave anything out. I feel like I'm definitely leaving stuff out, but overall, I feel like Sioux Falls in general and just everywhere, like the stigma against mental health is starting to lessen a little
Hmm.
bit. That doesn't mean we fully understand it because we certainly don't, and not many people do, but
Yeah.
we've made progress.
I feel like maybe I'm so inundated with it because this is the world that I work in, and I've like purposefully chosen this world to work in and this kind of sector of things. And so I think that you're absolutely right. We're going to leave something out because, there's so many things that are happening. And yes, some are great, some could use some improvements, but I think you're absolutely correct in that we're doing a pretty good job, but we have worlds to go too.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I talk about this stuff all the time just because, like I said, I'm so inundated in it. But I would say Sioux Falls, I think, is on the right track for sure. And
Hmm.
that's just someone coming in, I've only lived here for 2 months now. And so, I guess it's further along than I would have ever anticipated before
Hmm.
moving here. So that, I mean, is a light to look forward to. But
Hmm.
anywho, so I think we're wrapping up on time here. But
Perfect.
so I want to end by asking a couple other questions.
Yeah.
First and foremost, if you were to talk to someone on the streets today, and this is just totally out of left field, what would be a piece of advice that you would give someone, whether it is, in helping a friend or a family member or a loved one with their mental health challenges, whether it is they're struggling and are looking for resources and support, or whether they're looking to get into mental health education
Hmm.
or the law enforcement or the higher education or the medical field because they want to make some changes. What is one piece of advice? I know that was a lot, but that you would just give someone on the street that if you were to talk to them about this stuff?
Yeah, I would definitely say just have empathy. I mean, it sounds so cliche, but you just truly never understand what someone's going through, and just not judging a person by one instance of
Mhm.
their behavior. I mean, we all have bad days. We all maybe don't hold the door open for someone or
Sure.
don't smile at someone or like come across cold at times, but it's just like there's usually a reason for why that is, and
Mhm.
regardless of the reasoning, the person has the right to feel however it is that they're feeling, and so never trying to invalidate anyone's feelings, I think, is incredibly important because
Yeah.
um that's the most important thing ultimately, is that they're feeling something and allowing themselves to feel something. Now, granted, that's never an excuse to treat people poorly, but just keeping in mind that there's a lot of times more going
Yeah.
on than what a person is showing outwardly.
Great. And kind of last question here. Where can people find your work if they're looking to connect with you? I mean, you're obviously doing amazing stuff and you're involved in a ton of things. So where can people find you?
Like my social medias.
Social, a project that you're working on? Tell
Oh.
them to come to Augie. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you can find me at Augustana. I work at Augustana, like I'd said. I'm the assistant director of admission, and so I'm there most of my days. But if not, you could also maybe catch me at the dog park, considering I have two puppies. But yeah, otherwise, social media. My Instagram's Wendy Mamer, Facebook Wendy Mamer. So yeah. You make me sound way more cool than I actually am.
I don't believe that for a second. Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for being here, Wendy. It was a blast today. I mean, I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point, and we'll always be continuing this conversation. But just thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Lost and Found and what I'm doing for work, you can go to resilienttoday.org and make sure that you rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever podcasts are found.